Hi, my name is Mike Howell. I'm a reporter with Glacier Media, and today I'll be speaking with Vancouver Police Chief Adam Palmer. This interview is a part of a podcast of discussions that examine Indigenous issues in British Columbia as we approach National Indigenous Peoples Day, which goes Sunday, June 21st. This interview is a follow-up to one I did with Chief Palmer in 2016 when we discussed the relationship between the VPD and the Indigenous community in Vancouver. 4 years later, it's time for an update. Chief Palmer has been good enough to join us today via Zoom to give us that update. So welcome, Chief, and thanks for doing this.
Thank you, Mike. Happy to be here.
I know you've regularly attended National Indigenous Peoples Days in the past in Vancouver, but because of the pandemic, I take it you won't be able to do that this year. So just wondering how you plan to mark the day.
Yeah, so you're right. I mean, I think the whole world has been thrown into a bit of a flux with COVID-19 and different things going on. So events as we know it will not be taking place. But there are different things that we can do to recognize this important day through, virtually through social media and, different types of, recognition that we can do in the department. I also just earlier this week, we had, I have a number of committees that are involving Indigenous members of our community. And just in the past week on last Thursday and Friday, I had a couple of meetings with my Indigenous Advisory Committee, which is leaders from the community, as well as the Sister Watch group, which is another group of Indigenous women, predominantly from the downtown east side. So these are the types of things that we talk about, all kinds of issues in the community. But yeah, it is unfortunate that and other events like, Lunch with the Chief and other things at the Carnegie that we're just not able to do right now.
Okay, so back in 2016, you described the police department's relationship with the Indigenous community as, quote, very good, unquote. I'm wondering how you describe it in 2020.
Yeah, thank you. Very topical question because, of course, even in the past few months, we've had so many things that have transpired in world events. Now we're sitting in June of 2020, and in March, of course, we had the COVID-19 pandemic, and then more recently, at the very end of May into the beginning of June, we had the George Floyd incident happen down in Minneapolis, and that, of course, led to widespread protests and demonstrations throughout the Western world. And while that fellow that was murdered in Minneapolis was Black, it did open up discussions on people from all different backgrounds. And in Vancouver, in addition to Black Canadians and Black Vancouverites, also the issue of Indigenous relationships with the police. So very topical. I still think that our relationship is very good. I have to say that it is a relationship that we do put a lot of effort into, and it's a relationship that is very important to us. And it's something that we want to make sure that we're always, continuing to build on that and make it stronger. Recent events have made it difficult, to be quite frank with you. I know there is a lot of anti-police sentiment right now throughout Canada and the United States, and I'm hearing over in Australia and Western Europe and Spain and Belgium and the UK, really all over the world right now. So it's a challenging time for police and community relations, which are challenging sometimes at the best of times, and this has made it even more difficult. But when somebody asks me about a relationship with the community, I just think it's important to remember also that community, it depends how you define it, because there are many individuals in the community and different groups who I have a great relationship with, including members of the advisory committee who are a cross-section of people from the community, as well as Sister Watch, which is a different group, and other people that I meet. And those relationships are very positive. And I think, as you know, two of our board members, Wendy John and Claire Marshall, are also Indigenous. So we do have very good relationships, but the Indigenous community is very large in Canada and BC and in Vancouver. So believe me, I don't think that you're going to walk up to every Indigenous person in Vancouver and say the relationship with the police is great, because that's not practical. And I think a lot of people, probably people that, may not know me or have had a bad experience with the police, may say the relationship is not good. So I do recognize that.
What was the relationship like when you joined back, I think it was 1987? You joined the police department. What was the relationship like then between the Vancouver police and the Indigenous community?
Yeah, it was 1987, you're right. Completely different back then. We had a different generation of police officers when I came in. And I would say, just generally speaking, even the whole concept of community policing, where you could argue that, that probably dates back to Robert Peel in 1829, but I think a lot of things got lost along the way. And I think police, probably through the 50s, 60s, 70s, even into the 80s, there was a lot of call response driven type approaches to policing and public safety. And then, the 90s hit and things, I think, did open up better for police community relations. And we did focus more on that and starting to pay more attention to what our communities are saying. And I think we do a better job now of it today in 2020 than we've ever done. But comparing it to 1987, which is 33 years ago, it's like night and day. Back then, I would say that we responded to calls for service and we would deal with people from all different backgrounds. But there was no, at least not that I was aware of, any specific community outreach. There may have been. It didn't filter down to me as a frontline officer, and I didn't have the impression back then that our relationship was particularly good with the Indigenous community.
So what kind of training, I'm sure a lot of people have asked you this and asked the police department, what kind of training do police officers get in terms of the history of Indigenous peoples in this country? What do they know about the Indian Act? What do they know about the 60 Scoop residential schools? Maybe you can explain a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. That is such, again, very topical issue. And policing, I would say, if you compare it to other professions, and I know that there are other professions that do, of course, give their employees training, but I haven't seen any that have training to the extent that police officers get. Maybe I'll just start by saying, like, the screening process that we have now to become a police officer, even before they get into training, is so extensive, and the processes that we put them through to make sure that we're taking the right people, community-minded people, open and fair-minded people, compassionate people. We don't want people coming into our organization that may have, hatred running through their veins, or people that are against any group at all. We want people that are open-minded, thoughtful, compassionate, and care about their community. So that is the first screening step. And what's interesting about that is that if you think of any other occupation, including media or nursing, healthcare, the legal system, doctors, medical system, anything like that, lawyers, the training that you get in those professions is very specific to your occupation. So you go to university, you get a degree in whatever, you have that qualification, you may get a criminal records check, which is a very bare bones background check, and then you can go become whatever your profession is because you have that education. In policing, we have people coming in with degrees in various things, but the amount of background check and screening that we put people through is far beyond any other occupation. So we do weed out people that are of ill character. Once they're in, we do give them training through the Justice Institute of British Columbia that has a curriculum that does include Indigenous studies. But in addition to that, the VPD provides more training than any other police service in British Columbia. We provide an additional 200 hours to our recruits, which is about 5 weeks of additional training in addition to what they get at the police academy on a whole host of things. But in their police academy training, in our training that we provide them, and then also ongoing training through what we call team training or cycle training, where we bring them in 4 days per year, where they get 4 full days of additional training on a whole host of things. Of course, not just on Indigenous issues, but on a whole host of things. We're a very well-trained department. So we have gone through provincially mandated training, such as fair and impartial policing. We have had Indigenous cultural competency training here at the VPD. We've actually just in 2020, through Reconciliation Canada, adopted a new training protocol that we're starting to put all of our recruits through. This training, of course, has been hampered by the fact that COVID-19 hit recently. So unfortunately, that is on hold right now. But we are looking to run all of our new recruits through additional training. We met with Shelley Joseph from Reconciliation Canada. Her dad, of course, Dr. Robert Joseph, is very well known and respected in the Indigenous community. We think it's some of the best training that's out there, and we're excited to have our new officers go through it. But we're also going to incorporate that in our cycle training so that even currently in-service officers will get that training as well. So there's a number of things that we do provide to officers.
How many Indigenous officers do you have in the department right now?
We have 28.
28.
It's roughly split. I think it's about 15 men, 13 women. It's pretty close to 50-50.
What are you doing to recruit more?
So our recruiting in Vancouver, we do want people of diversity, but we want people also that are just well qualified and the right personality and right sense of humanity and compassion, as I mentioned, to be working as police officers and have a service mentality. So We have some pretty exciting things in the pipe that we think are working out well for us. So, and again, Indigenous, but it really applies to other cultures as well. But specific to Indigenous, we do specific outreach. We have gone up to Haida Gwaii and met with people up in Haida Gwaii area. We've been up to Prince George and other areas in northern British Columbia. We also have a really exciting cadet program in Vancouver where we have youth ages grade 10 to grade 12. And that is an extremely diverse group of young men and women from the Vancouver school system. A lot of kids from the east side of Vancouver from many, many different cultural backgrounds and ethnic backgrounds, including a lot of Indigenous kids. But we have a full continuum now, basically from when you're 15 years old, right up to when and if you want to become a police officer. So you can go through our cadet program, which is sort of like, scouts or, Navy cadets or that kind of thing. But after you go through that, you can apply to become a special municipal constable, a community safety officer, jail guard, traffic authority, that kind of thing, which is sort of the first tier of policing. And then you can move from that into becoming a regular officer. But in addition to our cadet program, we also have an Indigenous cadet program, which is for kids a little bit older, young adults, I should say, not kids, but people sort of 19 to 25 in that age range. And we bring them in on a summer program where we pay them a salary and they work with us in the police department doing civilian type work, but they get exposed to the police department. And we have recruited people through that strain as well.
Last week, you're aware that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said that systemic racism exists in all Canadian institutions, including police departments. So do you think that applies to the Vancouver Police Department?
Well, let me tell you about that. So I know that everybody is getting asked that question. So I'm going to give you my answer because I think it's quite an involved topic. What I will say is that Canadians and Canada in general has a very, very long history of racism in this country that we cannot deny. This includes Indigenous folks that have been on this land for 10,000 or more years, and people that were the original people of Canada long before any settlers came from Europe or anywhere else. And I think from the first time that European settlers came here, Indigenous people in many cases were treated poorly. And we have a long history of that in Canada, and then into the residential schools, and then various incidents that have happened in my own department and in other police departments across the country. But just in Canadian society in general, I think Indigenous people have been treated poorly. I also think that racism in Canada extends to the Black community. It extends to the Jewish community, which normally is the number one highest group that is targeted for hate crimes in Vancouver, is anti-Semitic type hate crime. But also the Japanese during World War II, during the internments, Chinese Canadians dating back to the railroads being built in the 1800s, and then right up to 2020 when we saw COVID-19 hit. And we've seen a huge spike in Vancouver and other areas throughout North America, including Seattle and San Francisco and some cities in the East Coast, with anti-Asian racism. And Kamagata Maru with South Asian Canadians, LGBTQ community, you name it. There has been a lot of racist and improper, just terrible treatment of people in our country over many years. I do think that we do have some differences from the United States, but it is still a huge issue in our country. Policing is one institution, just like many other institutions throughout, the government or private sector, you name it. So I think that you can say that issue of racism permeates all throughout Canadian society. What I will say, though, if you're trying to pin me down on the Vancouver Police Department specifically, what I will say is, and I'm going to go back to some of my earlier comments, is that I'm not naive to think that we don't have, some people in this department or any police agencies that perhaps have views that are inappropriate or dark-hearted or whatever you want to call it, but just really, just a completely off-base way of thinking about race and how to treat other people. That's possible. And we do have oversight to root those people out. But what I am going to also say is that the vast, vast majority of people that work here are kind-hearted, caring, and compassionate individuals. And I'm going to point out to that recruiting process that I mentioned to you earlier, and that if you take it as a granted that people in Canadian society, we have an issue with racism in this country, There's nobody that does a better job of rooting people out and looking for people with extremist views or inappropriate views that we will not hire in this organization. Other companies do not have that same level of critique or a bar to get through. So the first thing is getting them through that, making sure that we're just taking fine young people to be part of this organization. The next thing is the training that we provide them. We provide people outstanding training, which I talked about a couple of minutes ago, so I won't reiterate all that. The third thing is the oversight. There is no other, and you've talked to me a number of times over the years, and I'm very consistent in this, that there is no other occupation that has more independent civilian oversight than policing. With the IO and the OPCC and the police boards and coroner's inquests and different inquiries and the media and BC Civil Liberties and Pivot, you name it, everybody is watching everything that we do with a fine-tooth comb. And I'm fine with that because we do have extraordinary powers as police officers, can take people's liberty away. We carry firearms and can arrest people. So we need to have that scrutiny for public confidence and confidence in the system. But I think that the stop gaps and checks that we have in policing are much more than other occupations in society. And of course, you're going to see, incidents arise, but the reason for that is because society asks police, and we actually have a legal obligation to go out there and take on some of the most challenging and difficult situations that life could possibly throw at society, at human beings. And we're human beings as well. We're members of your community, we're, your relatives in many cases, we're your coaches, we're your volunteers, and we're just a segment of society. But you ask us to go out and deal with people who maybe severely have severe mental health issues, organized criminals, terrorists, people that are breaking into houses, people that are committing violent crimes, sexually assaulting people, people on the worst day of their life that are in crisis. And you ask us to come and intervene there. And I'll tell you, Mike, like you hear a lot of conversations about, well, let's take all the mental health stuff away from the police. That all sounds fine in theory. And we are very open to having conversations like that, where police would not have to be burdened with dealing with all of these mental health issues. As I believe in Vancouver, we have many types of programs where we do partner with mental health professionals, and we do a lot of proactive work in that space where we help people before they get into crisis. But the reality is you're going to have times when somebody is waving a knife around in a laneway at 3 a.m., or somebody has jumped into the water, into the Pacific Ocean, and they're trying to kill themselves, or they're on the edge of a bridge trying to jump off. And I will tell you that psych nurses or social workers don't want to go into those types of calls by themselves. A psych nurse is not going to jump in the ocean and pull somebody out. A police officer will. A psych nurse is not going to stand on the side of a bridge and pull somebody over, 200-pound person back over the bridge. They're not trained to do it, and they shouldn't have to do that type of work. I think people that sometimes spend a lot of time, behind a desk or behind a computer and don't realize what it's actually like out on the streets of our city and some of the things that go on behind the scenes, and realize that we de-escalate well. I don't give you an exact number. Let's say well over 95% of the calls we go to are de-escalated with no problem, and you never hear a peep about it. But there's some calls you can just not de-escalate. And there's some people that are going through psychotic episodes, some people that are high on methamphetamine or other types of drugs, people that are just really not in the right space. And there are times that the police are going to have to fight with people and use force. Unfortunately, that is the reality. So, we get all this training and oversight, but it's impossible and really unrealistic to think that police officers will never have to go out and be put in these situations, because we are on a daily basis. So the long answer, yeah, I'm sure we have some people that have improper views and terrible views, but I would say that is a huge minority of our police department. And we have incredible people here. We don't have racists at the VPD. This is not a racist organization. We're very community minded, and we care about our community and compassionate to our community.
When people are talking about systemic racism, there are many in the community who point to the arrest in, I believe it was in December, of an Indigenous grandfather and his granddaughter
Right.
at the Bank of Montreal. And people say, well, that's an example right there of racism. Maybe you can explain what happened in there, and are people fair in saying that was an example of racism, where the people were handcuffed and a 12-year-old was handcuffed for the sole reason that she was Indigenous?
Well, it's interesting that you would say that for the sole reason that somebody's Indigenous. So I think that is sort of, I could see that as perhaps a leap in logic. I could see why people may say that, but I think that, for officers responding to a call in progress, based on the information we have, they're responding to the information at hand. And unfortunately, sometimes when we get to a situation, things don't always unfold as the information comes through 911. That's the specifics of that case I can't talk about right now because it is under investigation. But I do acknowledge that there's a number of incidents you can refer to in our history where we have done things that have happened in our community. But I also point out that we learn from every time we go into a situation and something happens, we want to learn from that, and we want to be better. But also, it is inevitable when we're responding to hundreds of thousands of calls per year in Vancouver and have about 1 million contacts with the public a year. There will be some instances where people will not be happy with that contact 100%. We don't like to see it, but we know that that will happen. But that particular case, I'm not going to comment anymore just because there is an ongoing investigation.
Do you think, though, you're quite aware of this movement to quote unquote defund police?
Right.
Do you think there's any merit in that? And if you do you think it would lead to better relationships within the Indigenous community and other racialized communities if you were to quote unquote defund police?
So again, that's not an easy answer, but I'll give you my thoughts on it. So the issue of defunding the police, I think first off, it's important to give some context that defunding the police is a movement that came out of the United States. It has now moved to Canada, and I'm aware it's also again in Western Europe and Australia. And this is being fed on the internet. So when I talk to my counterparts in other cities across Canada and in the United States, they're all receiving the same form letters. These things are all generated on the internet. It's basically fill in the blanks and send the same form letter off to your chief of police or your city councilor or your mayor. So, the letters are getting in, Houston, Texas, and San Diego, and Halifax, and Vancouver. They're all very similar. This is just an internet movement that has taken hold and is very easy to do just with a couple of clicks, and you can fire it off. They give you a whole list of all the people to send it to. Defund the police is a hashtag. It is a movement, but it really is a hashtag. And there is no plan behind it. It's all basically built on, emotional reaction coming out of something that happened in Minneapolis in the United States. Having said that, we are open to listening to what our community says. And when you've got thousands of people, tens of thousands of people in many cases that are, having an outcry for police can do things better and police need to do things differently, I'm totally fine with that and on board with that. And if the community wants to see us do things differently, then I'd love to be at the table and I want to be part of those discussions. But it has to be an informed discussion. It has to be evidence-based and a thoughtful discussion. And it can't just be a reaction to let's all of a sudden just cut the police and see what happens. The concepts about taking, the things that we hear consistently with folks talking about this movement are things like, the police not responding to mental health calls, the police not responding to domestic violence, the police not responding to calls like that. The thing I'll remind the community is that the people that have been calling for police not to go to mental health calls for years and have a better system is the police. And in Vancouver, Mike, I can point you to about 3 different reports that you're probably familiar with that we've put out on mental health and policing over the last 12, 13 years that talk about that issue. And society has asked us to do that, and society does not have the capability to do it. The healthcare system is not capable of doing it itself right now. So this all lands on us, and then people will turn around and complain because then we deal with mental health issues. I think there are better ways to deal with those sorts of things. I'm a big fan of dealing with upstream drivers of crime or social disorder, things related to poverty and homelessness and addiction and mental health issues. But to my previous comments as well, I think people have to be pragmatic and realize that it's fine like on some of the lower level things, but on some of the more serious cases we're talking about where people are dealing with severe mental health issues, and these are the cases that we get called to. These are cases where people are a danger to themselves or others. And those types of cases, when somebody is a danger, in many of those cases, it makes sense to have a police officer there. I'm all in favor of, taking away the lower level ones, but I don't want to see a social worker or a psych nurse be put in danger into a situation that they're not trained to deal with. So I just think having a good, robust conversation on it. Also remembering that there's different levels of government involved here. So policing is a provincial responsibility, but it's funded and you have local responsibility as well. So in Vancouver, we follow the Provincial Police Act, but we are governed by the Vancouver Police Board. Any funding that we get comes from the city of Vancouver, but it's important to remember that if money was to be taken away from the police in Vancouver, and if that's a decision that's made, then that's a decision that's made. But the funding for things like more mental health supports, housing, areas like that, that money comes from the province.
Mm-hmm.
The different areas of government. So it's a complex conversation.
Yeah, well, just to add a little bit more to that conversation, I know a lot of people point to the budget of the VPD and that it's gone up by 100 million in the last decade. So how do you explain that to the public? That's a huge increase, and I don't think like engineering or other departments have received that significant of an increase in the last decade.
Yeah, they have actually. And if you look at the
Yeah.
city government, you'll see that everything's gone up proportionately. So you'll see little tweaks between different departments, but the VPD's budget back then was about 20, 21% of the city budget, and it is today. And if you look back, going back to the early 90s, like almost 30 years, you will see that our percentage of the city budget has remained relatively stable. So it's a misnomer for people to think, and it's just blatantly incorrect for people to think that police budgets as a percentage of the full city expenditure has gone up exponentially, because it hasn't. The way that you see police budgets going up for a number of things. One is collective bargaining increases, which quite frankly is really largely out of our control. Being a major city in Canada, our collective bargaining increases are driven by national trends. So the arbitrators here, and we've just gone through a process of arbitration, we'll look at what police in Toronto, Calgary, Winnipeg, Edmonton, Ottawa, the big cities are being paid. And then Vancouver normally would follow suit through arbitration. And then the smaller cities in BC, like Delta, New Westminster, Abbotsford, et cetera, would just get the same percentage as Vancouver. So collective bargaining is one thing. The other thing that we've introduced into policing in the last decade, and over the last 20 years, but particularly in the last decade, has been technology. And the technology and the analytical capabilities that we have here, I'm just going to speak for Vancouver, but it's similar in other departments, is leading edge. And the capabilities we have now are really second to none, I would say, with our analytical capabilities that help us keep this city safe. The other thing is our staffing levels. So we did get approval from City Council back in December of 2017 on a 5-year plan where we had, this department has been reviewed by outside academics and experts twice in the last 15 years. The most recent one ending in December of 2017. So not that long ago, just over 2 years ago. And the results of that were agreed to by city staff and by council were an increase to the VPD of 172 positions, 52 civilian and 120 sworn positions. And now, due to those staffing increases in 2018, 2019, and now just into 2020, we're just getting back to 2009 staffing levels. So I think it's important for people to remember that we did face some cuts right after the Olympics, and that was due to the economic fallout from the 2009 financial crash. But now we're just getting back up to staffing levels of 2009. But in that time period, the population and the calls for service in Vancouver have gone up significantly. So
Good
it's
time for a couple.
a complex answer. And people say, 20%, but it's like me saying to you, X percentage goes towards libraries or healthcare or anything else. Without context, that percentage really doesn't mean anything.
Okay, have you got time for a couple more?
Sure, yeah, got a few minutes.
As you're aware, the mayor called on the provincial government last week for a review of policing. Mike Farnworth has turned around and said, yeah, we're reviewing the Police Act. I spoke to Chief Terry Teegee last week, the regional chief for the BC Assembly of First Nations, and he's calling for an overhaul in policing in British Columbia as well. What do you say to all these requests for an overhaul in policing in the province?
Yeah, so if the community and our board and the province believes that we need an overhaul, and there are things we can definitely do better, and I am convinced of that. So we would be all in and really happy to participate in any kind of a review, but it has to be something, as I mentioned earlier, that's done in a thoughtful process, listening to community, but also, from an informed perspective, evidence-based with good data, because people sometimes in the community have the best intentions, but they don't necessarily know the business. Just like, I may know a cursory bit about engineering or forestry or something, but I really don't know the forestry industry or the engineering profession that well to have an informed discussion on it. So that's why I think that we really need the right people at the table to make the right decisions, because if you make decisions, in a haphazard way and just, go off of a hashtag, that's no way to do business. And that will hurt public safety, not just in Vancouver, but really across this country. So we're happy to participate. And I would love to see, other levels of government or other agencies take on some responsibility, quite frankly, that should have been theirs to begin with, but they didn't take on and have fallen to police. There are areas in our society that other people should be doing, and either in concert with us or without us completely. And we have had to take those on because nobody else is doing it.
Okay. This time of demonstrations against police, you don't often hear from people who support the police. I read a tweet from one of your officers recently saying, and I just wrote it down here, that she had been a police officer since 1995, and she wrote on Twitter that she had never felt such hatred toward my profession as in recent weeks, and it hits me to my core.
Mhm.
What should the public take of that assessment from one of your own officers?
Yeah, I know that officer, and she's a highly respected, outstanding police officer. She's a patrol sergeant, works in the city, working, around the clock, 24/7. She's actually our police officer of the year in 2020 in Vancouver. So she has a lot of credibility, and I take what she says very seriously. And I've heard from other officers as well. And just on that note, I just want to say, like, going back, I'll get to your question, but just on the racism issue, I've asked officers in our department, male, female, Black officers, Indigenous officers, Chinese officers, South Asian officers, and they tell me, I say, well, what's your take on all this racism stuff? Because, I acknowledge I'm a white guy, and
Mhm.
being the chief, sometimes you can be removed from the front lines, and you can drink filtered water. But people that I've known for a long time and I trust and respect, and they tell me that, you know, they, when they come into this profession, like, they are not coming into it, thinking that it's a racist profession, and they have not had those experiences. They're treated very well by their coworkers, and it's a very welcoming and open organization that respects people from all different backgrounds. And when they're out on the streets, they're not seeing their coworkers treat people with racist attitudes either. So I just think it's an interesting observation, another one from the front lines. But with regard to the one you're talking about with that patrol sergeant, you got to remember, like, these folks, like, they are really good people. These are people from your community. They're really good, citizens, or, people of Canada, Canadian people that are passionate about public safety. They care about their communities. They have families. They have feelings. And, to come into work, 3 or 4 weeks ago, we were heroes, and everybody's dropping off things at the police station with COVID-19. And thank you for being a frontline worker, and thank you for being out there 24/7. To now all of a sudden, we're being vilified in the media because of something that happened in Minneapolis. And believe me, we're not perfect by any means, and we've got things that we can do better here. But all of a sudden, just this tide in the entire Western world that is not unique to Vancouver at all. Some of it, yes, we can do better, but a lot of it, quite frankly, is just over the top, the way the community has sort of turned in that regard. And these people are going out there, and they're facing very difficult calls, and they are out there 24/7 working shift work. And you do make a lot of personal sacrifices being a police officer with your kids, your families, the hours that you work, getting called out at all hours of the day and night for all kinds of things, including protests that we're dealing with now. It's a tough slog out there. And, to have people now just treating you a certain way because of the uniform that you wear, I mean, I think that sends an interesting message as well. So hard on these folks. And I'll tell you, like, I have a lot of respect for my frontline officers and our civilian members, everybody in this department. And I don't want to work around people that, don't have great morals and ethics, and people that have, bad views. I don't want to be around people like that either. And I don't think that I am. I think I'm in an organization with great people, and I feel for them, and I do defend them. And I think, as you know, Mike, if somebody does something wrong, then they have to, face the music and pay the consequences. But in many of these cases, we have to let things play out and be properly investigated and find out what the true situation is, because I know these calls they go into are tough on them. They're hard, and people make quick judgments without having all the facts. The other thing I'm going to say is that, when they're out there, don't forget, like, you'll focus on the one thing out of 1,000 that may go wrong in a police department. But these officers are also out there and they're getting assaulted, and they're getting kicked, and they're getting punched, and they're getting sworn at and degraded and spit on, and female officers having their hair pulled out, and just really disgusting things. So I think context sometimes is important in this profession that is not an easy profession. So it's hard on them. And I hate to see them treated like that.
Okay. So just to wrap up then, are you optimistic then, Chief, that the VPD's relationship with will improve with Indigenous community and other racialized communities? And I'm sure you're going to tell me yes, but what do you base that on?
Yeah, thank you, Mike. So I do think that things will get better. I think that we're going to continue to work closely with our Indigenous communities and other communities that we deal with here in Vancouver. It's all about relationships, and it's being open to change, open to discussion, not finger pointing or anything like that, but just sitting down and being respectful and having thoughtful dialogue. So I found things throughout my whole life have always worked well that way. Just finally, the one thing I would say to your viewers is that one thing they may find interesting is a new report that we just put out in May of 2020, so just last month. It's a community outreach report, and it's called the Vancouver Police Department Community Matters. So if you just Google VPD Community Matters or Vancouver Police Department Community Matters, you can bring up that report. And it's about 65 pages or so, talking about all the different outreach that we do in this city with the community. And I think it's a pretty impressive collection of work that we're doing. So viewers may find that interesting if they want to get some more info.
Okay, we'll leave it there. I want to thank you for joining me today. It was an interesting discussion. And thanks again, and we'll talk again soon.
Thank you, Mike.